In the early 1980s, the city of Kramatorsk was an unremarkable industrial town in the eastern part of the Soviet Union. It had factories, residential districts, schools, and apartment blocks built according to standard Soviet designs. Nothing about the city suggested that it would one day become the site of one of the strangest radiation incidents in Soviet history. One of these buildings was a typical multi-story apartment block constructed from reinforced concrete panels. Families moved into it expecting stability and safety. The apartments were small but functional. The walls were thick. The structure felt solid. Like millions of other Soviet citizens, the residents trusted that their homes were among the safest places they could be. For several years, life inside the building followed a familiar routine. Adults went to work, children went to school. Evenings were spent indoors, often in the same rooms, with furniture arranged tightly to save space. Beds, tables, and cabinets were commonly placed against the walls, as was normal in apartments of that size. What the residents could not know was that one of those walls was not simply a wall. Embedded deep inside the concrete was a source of ionizing radiation. It produced no heat, no sound, and no visible changes to the structure around it. The wall looked no different from any other. Yet radiation was passing through it continuously, penetrating furniture and human bodies without resistance. Exposure did not occur suddenly. It accumulated slowly, over months and years. At first, there were no obvious signs that anything was wrong. People continued their lives without suspecting that their environment was affecting their health in a way that ordinary medical explanations could not fully account for. Over time, some residents began to experience persistent health problems. These issues did not appear dramatic or unusual on their own. Doctors treated individual cases as they normally would, without considering the possibility of an environmental cause. No one had reason to suspect that a residential building could be the source of radiation exposure. The idea itself seemed implausible. Radiation was associated with nuclear power plants, military facilities, or industrial sites, not with homes. Certainly not with the walls of a living room or a child's bedroom. As a result, the true cause remained hidden. The building continued to be occupied. Families continued to live their lives within it. And the radiation source remained exactly where it had been since the day the building was constructed, silently affecting everyone who spent time near that wall. The origin of the radiation inside the building was not connected to nuclear power or military activity. It came from a much more ordinary place, industrial measurement. In the Soviet Union, radioactive sources were widely used in industry. Small sealed capsules containing radioactive isotopes helped measure density, thickness, and material composition in mines, quarries, and factories. One of the most commonly used isotopes for this purpose was cesium-137. It was compact, stable, and highly effective for industrial gauges. Near Kramatorsk, cesium-based equipment was used at a local quarry to measure material density during extraction and processing. The radioactive source was housed inside a protective metal capsule designed to prevent exposure under normal conditions. Such capsules were meant to be strictly controlled, regularly accounted for, and securely stored. At some point during routine operations, one of these capsules went missing. There was no explosion, no accident that forced work to stop, no immediate health effects that would draw attention. The loss was recorded, but its urgency was underestimated. Searches were conducted within the industrial site, but when the capsule was not found, the incident was quietly closed. Production continued. Materials kept moving through the supply chain. What was not considered was the possibility that the capsule had already left the quarry. Crushed stone and other construction materials from industrial sites were routinely transported to concrete plants. From there, they were mixed into reinforced concrete panels used in residential construction. This process was fast, standardized, and rarely subjected to radiation checks. Somewhere along this chain, the missing capsule was incorporated into building materials. Once embedded in concrete, it became effectively invisible. Encased within thick walls, it no longer posed a risk to workers handling it briefly, but it would become dangerous to anyone exposed to it continuously. When the apartment building in Kramatorsk was constructed, no one involved was aware that one of its concrete panels contained a radioactive source. Radiation monitoring during residential construction was minimal, and no instruments detected the anomaly. By the time the building was completed and occupied, the capsule was sealed permanently inside the wall. It could not be seen, heard, or detected without specialized equipment. For the residents, the danger had already become part of their everyday environment, long before anyone realized that a mistake had been made. After the building was completed, apartments were distributed to families in the usual manner. Some residents moved in immediately, others arrived months later. The apartments differed in size and layout, but their construction followed the same standard design. One structural wall ran through several units on multiple floors, forming part of bedrooms, living rooms, and shared interior spaces. Life inside the building was ordinary. Residents arranged their furniture based on convenience rather than design. In small apartments, space mattered. Beds were often placed against walls. Children's desks were pushed into corners. Closets and bookshelves lined the concrete panels that separated rooms from neighboring apartments. People spent long hours indoors, especially during colder seasons. Children slept close to the walls. Adults sat nearby in the evenings. Over time, proximity to the same section of the building became a constant factor in daily life. Radiation exposure, in this case, was not intense, but continuous. The source emitted gamma radiation that passed through concrete with little reduction. The doses received by residents depended on how much time they spent near the wall and how close they were to it. Those whose beds or workspaces were placed directly against the affected area accumulated significantly higher exposure over the years. Because the exposure was gradual, its effects were difficult to recognize. Residents did not experience sudden illness or immediate symptoms. Health problems developed slowly and appeared unrelated to one another. Medical records described a range of conditions that, taken individually, did not raise suspicion. Over the years, however, patterns began to form. Certain apartments showed unusually high rates of serious illness. In several families, multiple members were affected. Children who spent long hours sleeping close to the wall were often the most severely impacted. Despite this, no connection was made to the building itself. Environmental causes were rarely considered in residential settings. Each case was treated separately without a broader investigation into shared living conditions. People moved out. New families moved in. The wall remained in place, exposing successive residents in the same way. The passage of time blurred the connection between cause and effect, making it even harder to identify a single source behind the growing number of health issues. By the time suspicions began to arise, years had already passed. The radiation source had been active for a long period, and its impact had extended across multiple generations of occupants. What had started as an unnoticed construction flaw was becoming a long-term public health problem, still hidden, still unexplained, and still embedded in the structure of the building itself. By the late 1980s, the number of serious illnesses connected to the building could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Medical professionals and local officials began to compare cases more closely. While no single diagnosis explained everything, the concentration of illnesses within a limited number of apartments raised concern. Radiation specialists were eventually contacted to conduct environmental measurements. This step was unusual for a residential building and reflected the absence of other plausible explanations. At the time, such inspections were rare and typically reserved for industrial or military facilities. When radiation monitoring equipment was brought into the building, initial measurements in common areas showed nothing out of the ordinary. Background radiation levels appeared normal. However, when detectors were placed closer to specific interior walls, the readings changed significantly. In several apartments, radiation levels near one particular wall were far higher than expected. The increase was not uniform throughout the building, but sharply localized. The closer the detector was placed to the wall, the higher the readings became. This indicated that the source was not external, but embedded within the structure itself. Specialists repeated the measurements at different heights and in different apartments. The pattern remained consistent. Multiple units on different floors showed elevated radiation levels along the same vertical section of the building. This ruled out household items or personal belongings as possible sources. Once the location was narrowed down, authorities approved the dismantling of part of the wall. This decision was not taken lightly. Removing structural elements from a residential building required coordination, evacuation of residents, and official authorization. When the concrete was cut open, investigators found a small metal object embedded deep inside. It was a sealed radioactive capsule, heavily corroded but still active. Tests confirmed that it contained cesium-137. The capsule was immediately removed and transferred to a secure facility. After its extraction, radiation levels in the affected apartments dropped to normal background values. The measurements confirmed that the wall had been the sole source of prolonged exposure. The discovery explained years of unexplained illness. It also raised serious questions about how such a source had entered the building materials in the first place and why it had remained undetected for so long. While the immediate danger was eliminated, the consequences of long-term exposure could not be reversed. After the radioactive capsule was removed, authorities faced the challenge of managing the consequences of a problem that had existed for years. The immediate priority was to ensure that no further exposure occurred. Residents from the most affected apartments were relocated while additional inspections were carried out throughout the building. Radiation measurements were repeated in all units and common areas. Once the contaminated wall section was dismantled and replaced, the building was declared safe for habitation. From a technical standpoint, the problem had been resolved. From a human standpoint, the situation was far more complex. Medical records were reviewed to determine the scope of the impact. Several residents had already died by the time the source was discovered. Others were undergoing treatment for serious illnesses. In some families, the health effects would continue to appear years later, long after the radiation source had been removed. Official investigations confirmed that prolonged exposure to cesium-137 was the most likely cause of the elevated illness rates. However, establishing direct legal responsibility proved difficult. The capsule had passed through multiple stages: industrial use, material processing, construction, and housing allocation, without detection. As a result, accountability became fragmented. No single organization was publicly named as responsible for the incident. Reports were compiled, internal conclusions were reached, and the case was effectively closed at the administrative level. Public communication about the incident was limited. Information was shared primarily with those directly affected. There was no widespread announcement or public discussion of the event. This approach reflected broader practices of the period, where incidents that could undermine trust in infrastructure or state oversight were handled discreetly. Compensation for residents varied. Some families received financial support or alternative housing. Others received little more than medical follow-up. Decisions were made on a case-by-case basis, without a unified national response. Although the building was technically safe again, its history remained known to those who had lived through the incident. For former residents, the knowledge that years of exposure had gone unnoticed created a lasting sense of uncertainty. The removal of the source ended the immediate risk, but it did not erase the long-term consequences for the people who had lived with it. In the years that followed the Kramatorsk incident, the building continued to stand as an ordinary residential structure. To anyone unfamiliar with its history, there was nothing unusual about it. The apartments were occupied, daily life resumed, and the physical traces of the radiation source were gone. What remained were records, medical histories, and unanswered questions about how a radioactive source could pass unnoticed through so many stages of oversight. The incident exposed weaknesses not in a single system, but across an entire chain of industrial and administrative processes. The use of radioactive materials in industry was common and, in many cases, effective. However, the systems designed to track and control these materials depended heavily on accurate reporting and strict compliance. When a failure occurred, its consequences could extend far beyond the original site of use. The Kramatorsk case demonstrated how long-term, low-level exposure can be especially difficult to detect. Unlike acute radiation accidents, which produce immediate and obvious effects, chronic exposure develops gradually. Its symptoms resemble common illnesses, making early identification unlikely without targeted investigation. For public health authorities, the incident became an example of how environmental factors can influence health outcomes in residential settings. It also highlighted the importance of monitoring construction materials and maintaining traceability for hazardous sources, even when they are small and seemingly insignificant. Internationally, similar cases have since reinforced the same lesson. Small radioactive sources, when misplaced, can create serious risks if incorporated into everyday environments. The Kramatorsk building was not unique in principle, but it was one of the clearest demonstrations of this type of failure. Today, the incident is studied as part of radiation safety history. It serves less as a story of blame and more as a reminder of how complex systems can fail quietly. The danger did not come from a reactor or a laboratory, but from a place designed to offer protection. The residents trusted their walls. The walls did what they were built to do. They simply contained something they never should have.